All calm in Kazakhstan. Russian troops begin leaving the country as the new government gets to work. President Tokayev is promising reforms while blaming his long-ruling predecessor for the unrest. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today on The Newsmakers, we ask, what's next for Kazakhstan? A new government has been sworn in Kazakhstan after ministers resigned in the face of mass protests just over a week ago. President Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has appointed a new prime minister, restoring at least the appearance of political stability in a country where dissent is rare. A New Year's rise in fuel prices sparked demonstrations that morphed into Kazakhstan's deadliest violence since gaining independence 30 years ago. The president claims anti-government riots were part of an attempted coup. Authorities responded with a severe crackdown, detaining around 12,000 people. And controversially, the president invoked a mutual defense clause of the CSTO, the Collective Security Treaty Organization, calling in Russian-led troops to quell the unrest.
The situation in all regions is stable. Thereby, I have to say that the main mission of the CSTO peacekeeping forces has been successfully completed. In 2 days' time, a phased withdrawal of the CSTO United Peacekeeping Contingent will begin. The withdrawal process of the contingent will take no more than 10 days.
But the arrival of those Russian-led troops caused concern among Western countries. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken urged Kazakh authorities to respect the rights of protesters while maintaining law and order on its own, warning President Tokayev that it could be very difficult to get Russian troops to leave.
The presence of peacekeeping forces has enabled us to focus on bringing the situation under control. Despite statements that a military force was seizing an opportunity, the president confirmed again yesterday that the CSTO peacekeepers had been invited to Kazakhstan to solve the problem. I want to emphasize once again that the CSTO peacekeepers are not directly involved in operations against the terrorists, but are there to protect our strategic facilities. The direct anti-terrorist operations were carried out by special police forces of Kazakhstan. We overcame the threat by our own force.
Well, now that the situation has stabilized, Tokayev is promising reforms and an end to corruption and cronyism. In his most recent address, Tokayev claimed that years of mismanagement led to the unrest, accusing former President Nursultan Nazarbayev of creating a layer of wealthy elite and enriching his own family.
Thanks to the first president, Nursultan Nazarbayev, the leader of the nation, a group of very profitable companies and a layer of wealthy people, even by international standards, have appeared in the country.
Well, joining me now to talk further about what's next for Kazakhstan and whether peace can be sustained is from Prague, Torokul Doorov. He is the Kazakh Service Director for Radio Free Europe. Matthew Bryza joins us from Istanbul. He's a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Eurasia Center and a former U.S. ambassador to Azerbaijan. And in Milan is Eleonora Tafuro Ambrosetti, a research fellow specializing in Central Asia and Russia at the Italian Institute for International Political Studies. Thanks all so much for being with us. You know, it's more than remarkable that just a few days ago, we were looking at burning buildings and evacuations, and now we have a full reopening, apparent peace on the streets, and a new government supposedly getting to work. Matthew Bryza, how did that happen? And is Kazakhstan really stable now?
Well, first of all, I don't think Kazakhstan's really stable now. How it happened was there were organic, sincere protests in the far western part of Kazakhstan. Zhanaozen is the town. It had been sort of a hotbed of protest for over a decade when there were riots that were repressed by the government back then in 2011, and 14 or so oil workers were killed. So those protests kind of were re-sparked by an increase at the first of the year in the price of the main auto fuel, which is liquid petroleum gas, LPG. And the protests quickly spread. across the country, all the way to Almaty, which is strange or unusual because in Almaty, there's been stability. It's a prosperous city. There are much more people who are doing well there. So it was unusual to have protests there.
Right. But I mean, how did they manage to get it under control this quickly? That's where we're at now.
Yeah. So there was, a brutal backlash against the protesters, with 168 or so of the protesters killed. The government has claimed that the protests became violent when some phantom group of foreign-trained terrorists took over. It is clear from the eyewitness accounts that I've read and heard that something did change. The crowd went from a peaceful protest to a violent one, which happens everywhere. It happens in the United States with protests on the streets, whether it's for Black Lives Matter or other protests. So for me, it's highly dubious that there were any foreign-trained terrorists who came in. There's no evidence whatsoever of that. I think President Tokayev got really nervous. He maybe panicked, and he decided to consolidate power. In fact, de facto, to seize the real power, which was still in the hands of former President Nazarbayev. So he removed Nazarbayev from Nazarbayev's lifelong appointment as head of the National Security Council, and then arrested the head of the intelligence services, who was really Nazarbayev's right hand, Karim Masimov, who was, in a way, the transmission belt of actual power from Nazarbayev to the more of a figurehead power, which was then President Tokayev. So he's consolidated his hold on power now, but how long will that last? When the Nazarbayev team fights back, that remains to be seen.
Yeah, I want to talk further about that a little later on. But as you said, Matthew, he got nervous, President Tokayev, and Eleonora, he at that point called in the CSTO, Russian-led CSTO troops. A lot of people credit them for bringing this, semblance of full stability now. But some are now arguing there's a price to pay for that. Do you think Kazakhstan now owes Russia something? And if so, what is Moscow really expecting in return?
Absolutely. I think, Russia expects something in return for the support, because we have to remember that, of course, the intervention was made under the CSTO, which is an organization, and that was, by the way, headed by Armenia. So it was formally Yerevan who gave the green light for the intervention, but the decision was made in Moscow, and the bulk of the soldiers also are Russian. So I think there is a tweet by Margarita Simonian, the head of the RT news channel, which is basically, a Kremlin-affiliated media. So it's usually the voice of the Kremlin. In this tweet, Margarita Simonian explains it very well. We have to help our allies, but we cannot do it without asking anything in return. And, the requests that could come from Russia are, for example, the stop to the transition from the Latin alphabet to the from the Cyrillic alphabet to the Latin alphabet, for example, or a more friendly policy towards Russian schools, which were basically were closed in Kazakhstan, and in general a much friendlier policy towards Russia. That's what the Kremlin asks in return, and probably will get it.
It's so interesting because it may sound symbolic, but it does matter to Russia in maintaining its kind of sphere of influence, and seeing a country like Kazakhstan move away from the Russian language, changing the alphabet. Russia really doesn't want that. So yeah, very interesting. I'm going to come back to some of that, Eleonora, but I want to go to Torokul Doorov and talk about what is the situation on the ground in Kazakhstan right now. We're hearing there are still almost 10,000 people detained. Tell me, how much does it matter how those detainees are treated now from this point forward? Because human rights groups especially will be watching very closely, and they're already worried about what's happening in respect to maintaining human rights in the country.
That is true. Actually, I agree with Matthew saying that the situation, we cannot say completely stabilized, but it looks like it is stabilized from outside. The country is now out of internet blackout. And public transportation, shops, banks, and work in the most suffered city of Almaty. And even the President Tokayev's decision yesterday evening about early lifting of the state of emergency in some regions was dedicated, I think, to show that the life is returning to normal. However, as you said, until now we haven't heard, we don't have a clear kind of, understanding about the number of casualties from the latest unrest. We still do not know how many people died, even though there was an information about 164 people dead, that it was later denied, saying that it was just a technical mistake. And Ministry of Internal Affairs reported about 10,000 people arrested. Human rights activists, as you are saying, that telling that many peaceful demonstrators are among them right now, and many innocent civilians might be among them either. And our journalists are telling from different cities that there are so many people now in front of morgues or in front of police stations trying to get some information about their beloved ones. And we already heard from yesterday, Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch already expressed their concern about these arrests, arbitrary arrests. And yesterday we have reported about the arrest of journalist in Akmola region just for his several questions to President Tokayev on Facebook. So we don't know how long it will continue and what is happening now with interrogation of those people.
Right. President Tokayev actually insinuated that he thinks journalists and some human rights activists may be partly responsible for the chaos that we saw in the last week. I mean, how much does that concern you? And if you could advise the government right now on how to manage this situation and manage those detainees in order to not scar further its reputation going forward, what would you tell them?
Many journalists and human rights organizations have received last week's address to nation of the president, where he criticizes free media and human rights activists for destabilizing the situation very negatively and with a big, alarm because the country is, we don't know where it's toward turning in front of the, it is happening just on the wake of deployment the Russian troops, and whether the Russia is directing this all and what will happen with thousands of people, because overall the country and government was not at least a democratic government for many years. And we have been telling, and human rights organizations have been reporting about arrests and labeling the political movements as extremist several years now already.
Right. Matthew, I think you had a comment. If so, go ahead.
I did. I think this human rights story is a huge one. There are increasing reports of former senior officials of the Kazakhstani government mysteriously jumping out of windows to their deaths, suffering heart attacks. The imprisonment and accusation of treason of Karim Masimov for organizing a coup is illogical and ridiculous. Masimov was the real power on the ground. He was the one who was the transmission belt, again, from Nazarbayev through to Tokayev. Tokayev was a safe pair of hands when Nazarbayev decided to leave day-to-day political life in Kazakhstan in 2019. So how can you launch a coup attempt against yourself if you're the one that has the real power? So I smell a pretext, scapegoating, a brutal crackdown that's involving deaths, and one that it really risks soiling the great reputation of Kazakhstan as a stable place where big investment could happen, would be protected, and where generally there was political stability. It wasn't ever considered to be a full-scale democracy, but a wide-scale violator of human rights. That had never been Kazakhstan, and that is not who Jumar Tokayev ever was as a professional diplomat. He's genteel, he's mild-mannered. Something snapped, and this is now a titanic political fight to the death.
Let me ask Eleonora if you're on the same page there, that this was in no way really an attempted coup. because this is what the government its bottom line really is, that this was a manipulated attempt to overthrow the government. Is there any truth to that from what you've seen in your research?
Well, of course, it's very difficult to have an informed opinion on that. What we see from the outside is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many things that remain unclear. But from what I've seen so far, I think this was rather a justification that the Tokayev government took to request the help from the CSTO, but I think the protests are in every country are complex phenomena, and of course there are many forces that fight alongside the protesters. But I haven't seen really a big role from foreign actors to overthrow the government. I think this was rather a reaction and a justification to ask for help.
Right. Torokul, if I can ask you, the government continually cites these terrorist groups for being responsible and trying to take control here. Give us some idea of what they're actually talking about. They're very nonspecific. Who are these groups that they're referring to, and these sleeper cells they've even been speaking about that were trying to undermine the government and also took advantage of the kind of vacuum after these first peaceful protests started?
Yeah, first of all, now it is clear that there was a power fight between the leaders, two leaders of the country. And it seems that President Tokayev has got everything under control. For several days, it started, as Matthew said, as a peaceful demonstration in the western part of the country. But later, Tokayev announced about 20,000 terrorists came from outside. And it is probably, as Eleonora is saying, that it was a justification for calling CSTO troops to the country, because CSTO cannot intervene into their internal kind of unrest inside the country. We know that CSTO has never been involved in such operations before. We can remember 2010 Kyrgyzstan ethnic clashes, or 2020 Armenia, Azerbaijan Nagorno-Karabakh crisis. This military organization has never been involved. But in this case, it was involved very much. And there are so many speculations are now being circulated, whether it was well planned ahead beforehand, or some criminal elements using this opportunity, using this time when the Western parts unrest or protest got so huge support from other parts of the country, started using this opportunity to destabilize the situation.
Okay. Let's go forward now. Matthew, I'll come back to you. There were obviously legitimate grievances, or else the president would not be talking about reforms, necessary reforms right now. But is Tokayev in any way the leader that can fight corruption and really address the economic inequalities that sparked this all in the first place? Or is he still too much part of the corrupt elite?
Well, that is a really fascinating question. So while he has been president since 2019, he has been involved in reforms, and he was sort of shunted off to the side. He wasn't leading the potentially really thoroughgoing reforms. And anybody who knows him, Torokul has probably met with him many times, and Eleonora, I have many times in my government career. He's a genteel, erudite, professional diplomat who seems soft rather than hard in crude terms. And somebody who, we all always assumed had his heart in the place of modernizing and reforming Kazakhstan. Now, because of these strange circumstances that we've been talking about, he's at the center of a power struggle. He knows that reforms have to happen. He's aware of the discontent in Zhanaozen and across the country, but he has now really soiled himself and his reputation through the brutality of the response, and frankly, through the complete lack of credibility about the terrorist attacks. I mean, he gave the really embarrassing speech the other day when he said, well, we can't show you any evidence of the actual terrorists, terrorists because the terrorists attacked the morgue and they took the bodies of their fallen comrades and took them away so that they could hide their tracks, so there'd be no signs of the actual terrorists. So that is not credible. So he now sits at the top of the pyramid, the Nazarbayev pyramid that Nazarbayev built, without Nazarbayev and without the key officials that really were wielding the actual power. That is a tough challenge, to fight Nazarbayev with Nazarbayev's own system, and Nazarbayev having billions of dollars parked in banks all over the world.
Okay. Eleonora, what's your take on that? I mean, should there be some confidence in Tokayev going forward that he can launch the reforms he's talked about and rid the country of this corrupt elite that's kept the concentration of so much wealth in the hands of a few and kept Nazarbayev's old regime very much in power?
Well, I think this is a critical moment for Tokayev. So I don't believe the efforts to fight against those corrupt and very wealthy elites will take place at the moment. The problem is that it doesn't enjoy such a strong support. So it wants to, for sure, cement its power. So I don't believe right now the necessary steps to fight those inequalities will take place now. But from what I see from outside, there is a certain endorsement of his leadership, at least from Moscow and partly from Beijing as well. So this could probably lead to a more stable rule and hopefully to more reform in the near future.
Okay. Torokul, I want to ask you a little bit more about some of his more detailed plans going forward, because it is really about taking on some very powerful big business in Kazakhstan. He says he's looking at taxing heavily mining companies who've been able to profit from higher metal prices, and some are hoping that's part of a larger trend to actually start taxing the elite that's been able to profit so much from the country's resources. Do you see that actually happening? Do you think Tokayev can really bring that forward and start to redistribute the country's general mineral wealth to poorer Kazakhstanis?
It was also interpreted as a part of Tokayev's now new kind of a program, and which is also illustrating the fight with Nazarbayev. He mentioned for the first time about Nazarbayev yesterday on Tuesday during his speech at the parliament presenting the new prime minister. And for the first time he mentioned El-Bassi, with sarcasm, with criticizing him, saying that during his presidency, only a small layer of rich people, even by international standards, appeared in the country. Tokayev has never told like this about Nazarbayev before, and he said those companies now should share with people of Kazakhstan their income. And now it will be definitely very difficult for Tokayev and his new government to go for those economic reforms. I'm pointing economic because he hasn't told anything about political reforms yet. And why it will be difficult? Because the new government, so-called new government, is actually an old government, because many vice ministers of the previous government came as ministers, and it's signaling definitely a big crisis in government personnel. How the country should be prepared for new professionals if in 30 years, according to many analysts, it was not raising that new elite in the government.
Torokul, I have to ask you, this is your country. I mean, are you glad what's happened has happened? Are you optimistic at all that it could fundamentally change your country for the better?
I am originally from Kyrgyzstan, but I work for Kazakhstan. I really now concerned about what is happening with ordinary people and civilians. We don't know many about this. In last 1 week, we have been hearing, and I saw from my colleagues who are now working with me that they were very much concerned about what is happening with their relatives, because we couldn't have any kind of communication tools. And of course, as my colleagues, I also concerned about the future of the country. I think this is a turning point. We just see now that Tokayev is trying to show confidence and trying to show that his presidency just started. And how it will start, I don't know, maybe by September, as he promised, we will see some political changes, because it will depend on Tokayev. Everything will depend on Tokayev.
Torokul, you will have the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and to our viewers as well. Thanks for watching. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter at @the_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.